So to continue with this lesson, lesson 13, chapter 18, the Proto-Renaissance in Europe, we're going to continue talking about this image. The one final thing that I was noting before the slideshow ended was this way that the fabric has been used to take a chaotic composition and to make it a little bit easier to see. Otherwise, we might be overwhelmed by figures. And if you want to go forward a few hundred years and look at the Night Watch by Rembrandt, that's a beautiful painting. But in that one, the figures are all shown, and he's used other devices to make it not simply become chaos. So now we're going to move from Florence and Padua to Siena and talk about another great artist at the time, which would be the artist Duccio. Here we have a reconstruction of the front of what's known as the Maesta altarpiece. Now this altarpiece was commissioned, this is 13 feet wide and 7 feet tall, and it was in 3 pieces. So we don't really know exactly what it looked like when it was assembled because it was deconstructed. But if you can imagine that this is only the central panel, and it had to be painted so that it could be seen from all sides because it was in the center of the church. And his workshop put it together, and then he painted these scenes. Now the large scene we have here is Mary and baby Jesus surrounded by 20 angels and 10 saints. And along the bottom there's a bunch of scenes from Christ's life. Now Duccio, he had a little bit more of a stiffer form than Giotto. He is said to combine the Byzantine with the Greek influences. So that's what we see here. Now let's look at the back. The back of the altarpiece is kind of hard to see in that there's, again, so many little detailed paintings, relatively small, that we can't really see it. It's more like a patchwork quilt. But let's look closely at one of them. Here we have his version of the raising of Lazarus. And it's a little bit different than we saw in Giotto, but we still have the figures in a more naturalistic setting. Maybe the proportions are not perfect. I would note that the woman who is bowing has a very teeny little head in Byzantine fashion, but still it's moving further and further away from the stiffness that we have seen in the Middle Ages thus far, leading us to the Renaissance. So as long as we're looking at altarpieces, let's look at just one more by Simone Martini and Lippo Memmi. Now this one is notable in that it's still in a Byzantine style, and yet it allows us to really celebrate and see the values of that style. Now let's look at another town hall. This one's in Siena. So it's pretty similar to the one that we looked at in Florence in that it's a big, huge building with a really tall tower. The building was built between 1297 and 1315, and the tower was from the 20s to the 40s, 1320s, 1340s. So this is the same idea, and that it's a building surrounding a square, and it's the seat of government for the town of Siena. Another similarity is that it was full of beautiful frescoes that were painted to decorate the interior. Now you're invited to look at the videos on fresco to learn more about how this process works. It's an important thing to know. So now as we go to the interior of the city hall of the town of Siena, we return to the first image that we talked about, the effects of good government in the city and in the country. One thing to notice is that this is about 46 feet long, so it's huge. And what's fun is that you can recognize the city of Siena in that time. So we get a portrait of a city in 1338, 13 to 1339, a city of the Proto-Renaissance. Now if you look closely, another thing that's interesting here is that we're beginning to see what we call linear perspective. So as the buildings kind of stack one against the other, they look a little bit more believable. They're not just floating in space. There's a little bit of an understanding of perspective and of how buildings exist in space. So here we have yet another version of it, And this is in the country, the effects of good government. Now this one's interesting, again, in the perspective and how he has sort of stacked the mountains one on top of the other. And it's just a really beautiful and interesting composition overall. So this is truly a masterpiece of the era. So now let's leave Italy and go to France for a little while. As we've seen earlier in the Middle Ages, Paris remained the center of the book arts. What was popular at this time, we're talking about the 1300s, 1200s, 1300s, was what they called a book of hours. And these were little prayer books that were commissioned by wealthy patrons and often carried or worn as jewelry. They were displayed, they were usually with the people pretty much wherever they went. Now you have to remember that at this time there's still no printing press, so all of these books were made by hand. And they were called a book of hours because they had usually 8 different practices for the people who owned the books to complete throughout the day. Now this one was commissioned by King Charles IV for his young bride Jeanne Devereux. And she was only 14 when she was given this gift. But the book was small enough to fit in the palm of her hand when it was opened. And she prized this book such that she gave it to her son in her will. And she mentioned the maker as well as the book itself. So here we have, it's a little hard to see, but you have a closer looks on this week. But you can see it's done in this black and white technique called grisaille, and with a little touches of color. This was very popular at the time, and there's even the Queen herself right there reading her book to show just how pious she really was. So in addition to being known for goldsmiths and for the illuminated manuscripts, Paris was also known as a center for creating these small ivory boxes. Now these were carried by wealthy ladies for them to store their jewelry and other very special possessions in. And what's noteworthy about these is that they had really very little to do with religion for a change. They were all pretty much based on romantic stories, and they were very secular in nature. So let's look a little bit more closely at this one. Now what's interesting about this box is that it's one of only 7 to survive intact that we know of. And there's fragments of roughly a dozen more, and that's it. That's all that remain in the world. So on the lid we have an attack on the castle of love, which is kind of, it's poignant. And here we have, let's go back to this attack, which does show jousting. See the jousters running towards each other with long spears on horses. Okay, now we're going to have the capture of the unicorn. See, there's the unicorn being slain. Okay, so this would have delighted wealthy ladies at the time. And I actually often stop and consider where the ivory came from, because these are rather large boxes when you consider that they're from ivory, which comes from a tusk of some kind of an animal, either an elephant, a walrus, or yeah, so that's kind of an interesting note also. So let's talk for a moment about gold, about sculpture that was also created in Paris at this time. And this particular piece is from the Abbey at Saint-Denis, which we talked about in Gothic, in our study of Gothic architecture. And it was actually donated by the very same Queen whose Book of Hours we looked at just a moment ago. That would be Jeanne Devereux, who was married to Charles IV of France. Now in this one you might want to look in your book on page 554 because you'll get a better look at it there. But there's some really interesting things to note. One of them is how humanistic Mary is, and Jesus is kind of pressing his hand up against her face. Around the base of this are 14 scenes from the life of Jesus, including the Passion, that sort of remind us of the suffering to come. Now, Jesus is also holding an apple, which in this medieval belief that Jesus came along to redeem sins that were originally set in motion when Adam took that bite of the apple way back at the beginning of time. So what we see here is a loosening up of style, is a humanizing of style. And you can't really see it here, but I want to invite you to notice when you look at other at other Jesuses, little babies, they look like old man babies, we call them, because traditionally in this time, the eyes were often way up in the head. Do you know that our eyes, if you look at a face, the eyes are halfway between the chin and the top of the head? Well, in children, the eyes are even lower. So as you look at this art, I invite you to notice that the babies look like old man babies, because in fact, the artists have not put the eyes in the appropriate place as one would see for a child. So that's a little side note from the painting teacher side of me to all of you budding artists out there, to notice where the eyes go in the head. And that would be located between the top and the bottom of the head. In an adult, in the middle, and in a child, they're a little bit lower. So now we're going to take a look at work from Germany. And this is a Pietà, and it really speaks to the idea of mysticism and suffering that was a prevalent ideal of the era. Now the term Pietà just means Mary holding the dead Christ. So here we have one where Christ has blood gushing from his wounds. It's actually rather horrific. And just to jump ahead a little bit, let's just pop ahead about 150 years and look at another version on the same theme, which is one of actually my favorite works of art of all time. I have many. But here we have the Vesperbild Pietà. And here we have Michelangelo's Pietà. Okay, let's go back. Here we have that, and here we have this. Two interpretations of the same theme, and this is designed to give you a little peek into what's going to happen in the Renaissance as art really changes in radical ways. So this theme of suffering really actually seemed to be prevalent in some of the lives of the people of the time, and we can see this in the Hedwig Codex. And again, a codex is a prayer book, and this was for Saint Hedwig of Silesia. And she was actually married at the age of 12 to Duke Henry. And when he died, she dedicated her life. Oh, she had 7 children by him. Remember, married at the age of 12, had 7 children. And then she entered a Cistercian convent. The Cistercians are, they are monastic, and they are ascetic. So they live very simple lives, withdrawn from the world. And she is said to have walked barefoot in the snow to remember the suffering of Jesus. And we see this here in this kind of prevalent attitude that life is suffering. But that's going to change. So now we'll wind up this lecture by looking at another master of the time called Master Theodoric. And this is his St. Luke, which was at Karlstein Castle, a day's ride from Prague, Czechoslovakia. Now, this chapel was commissioned by Charles IV, but it was adorned with these elaborate paintings that had jewels and gold, as well as the paintings themselves. Now, what's interesting about this one is it is of St. Luke, who is the patron saint of painters. And many people think that it's actually a portrait of the artist himself. Now, you can notice that the artist has portrayed this figure with big eyes, sort of big hands, but not too big, and a lot of decoration around the outside. This is typical of his style. Now, again, if we think back to the art that we looked at just 100 years previous, it has changed so much during this relatively short period in time. So now to wrap up, we're going to return to Giotto and St. Francis, because St. Francis was really the Franciscan belief in a world that didn't have to be full of suffering, and that life wasn't always, hell on earth. Really influenced the art of the Renaissance. So St. Francis lived from 1182 and 1226, and he's often called the prophet of the Renaissance. So with St. Francis, we get this new belief that nature is actually a force of good and gentle and something to be worked with. Now we can understand that for people coming out of the plague, this was really a breath of fresh air. Now, Giotto was a follower of St. Francis, and here we have St. Francis preaching to the birds who have interrupted his sermon, and he's told them, just wait, and you'll get your own sermon. So with this upbeat conclusion, we're going to come to the close of our lectures for the class. Thank you so much for your attention, And that's all.